Another round of victories on credit. Russian commanders are reporting to Moscow about the capture of the village of Pritoroznoye in the Zaporizhia region. The Southern Defense Forces explain the enemy's in a rush to redraw their maps and then send saboteurs for photo ops with the tricolor, photos that cost Russian soldiers their lives. Ukrainian soldiers emphasize that the settlement was and remains under Ukraine's control. That's what the Russians claims, and supposedly about the capture the day before of the village of Glashkovka in the Kharkiv region. The Russian Minister of Defense, Andrei Belousov, was quick to congratulate the Russian soldiers on the occupation of the settlement.
To the list of settlements captured by Russian generals in their dreams, fantasies, and reports to their superiors, in addition to Kupiansk and Kupiansk-Uzlovoy, the village of Glashkovka in the Kharkiv region has now been added. The Joint Forces Group reports that Russian troops not only do not control Glashkovka, but are not even present there in any form, not even as minor infiltrations. From the statement of the Joint Forces Group on Telegram,
since the beginning of the day, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has counted 74 Russian assaults in 12 directions. On the Guliai section of the front, the Defense Forces repelled 12 enemy attacks. Another 10 assaults by the occupying forces were stopped by the Ukrainian Armed Forces at the Konstantinovka bridgehead. And in the south of the country, according to analysts, the Russians are trying to advance at the Orakov defensive stronghold in the Zaporizhia region.
Indeed, this is one of the priority directions. As of today, there appear to be at least two of them. That is, these are the Pokrovsk-Myrnihad direction, and accordingly the Zaporizhia front, where the Russians have concentrated their main efforts. I think it's unlikely that these directions will lose their priority in the near future. Well, it's quite likely that Guliai will also remain active. Well, obviously, today, yes. They are trying to cross the Gaicha River and reach the West Bank. Our task here is to prevent them from doing this.
The Russian army's most active attacks were in the Pokrovsky direction, the Defense Department noted. Taking advantage of the weather conditions, Russian saboteurs attempted to advance north undetected, across, but they were spotted by Ukrainian drone pilots, after which artillery was fired. According to the military, the Russians were eliminated and the infiltration attempt was repelled.
It is quite reasonable to suggest that the Russian military forces are currently trying to carefully conserve their vital strategic reserves and resources now in order to preserve them for more critical operations in the near future. Move to the next stage, to the next offensive operation. But this is still a highly ambitious and incredibly bold assumption. The fact that the Russians have absolutely no clear intention whatsoever of stopping hostilities is also clearly demonstrated by the specific way they conduct the war. Now, and by and large, in their position on the international stage, on the diplomatic track.
1,250 Russian occupiers were eliminated by the defense forces over the past day. Ukraine's General Staff reports that since the invasion began, Russia has lost 1,247,500 personnel. Yesterday, Ukrainian defenders also destroyed 3 tanks, 3 armored vehicles, 12 artillery systems, over 400 vehicles, and more than 100 fuel tankers.
We'll discuss the front lines, how this reflects internationally, diplomatically, and politically with Oleksandr Leonov. Penta Center for Applied Political Studies Director joins us now. Welcome.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Good morning.
Good morning. Let's start with the strategy that the Russian Federation has chosen, namely the so-called imitation of successes on the battlefield in Ukraine. How effective is this strategy? Successful. And has Putin gotten at least some minimal result? Any kind of result from these fairy tales he's telling to the Western audience?
Let's be honest. Putin is primarily trying to influence Donald Trump because Donald Trump, let's remember, from the very first days of his second term, he started saying that Putin is making major concessions because he is not. Gonna seize all of Ukraine. And now, against the backdrop of Putin's truly blatant and significant failures in his strategic plans, because according to various reliable sources in the American media, Putin was absolutely adamant that he would eventually break through the front line. This was expected both in the middle of 2024 and again in the fall of 2024, and so on. So basically, Putin has plans. to put pressure on Ukraine, to put pressure on Donald Trump. And at a certain point, Donald Trump returns to the topic that Ukraine is losing this war. Although, against the backdrop of the Russian army's failures, let's be fair and remember that from time to time, Donald Trump says that Russia is not capable of winning this war. And so, in order to influence Donald Trump's emotional perception in this way, Putin tries to apply pressure in different directions. There's another aspect that, in all likelihood, has its own sphere of influence. It's the fact that Russia talks about the need to resolve the so-called territorial issue. That is, for Ukraine to completely surrender the currently unoccupied part of Donbass, and in return, Russia will withdraw from a number of in various other regions like Kharkiv and Sumy, they explicitly mention them by name. And in order to establish a strategic appearance that they actually control something there, and to gain significant leverage for future negotiations in front of Trump, they are also actively trying to show increased military activity in these specific areas. We can see this in Kupiansk. Sometimes this leads to extremely embarrassing and unfortunate results for Russia. When they declare the occupation of a particular settlement, then get completely pushed back and forced to retreat from there, they are inevitably forced to keep storming and storming it again just to validate and support the words of their supreme commander-in-chief. And from this point of view, I think this is the main factor influencing Trump. And this ongoing and deliberate attempt to present, a comprehensive territorial exchange fund proposal, which they are so aggressively and persistently pushing for during these complex negotiations.
Let's talk about how, in this regard, they are trying to operate on the informational level. Putin and his entire clique. So the Kremlin's own Führer claims that Russia is supposedly close to victory in the war against Ukraine. Well, at least that's the rhetoric. That's always the case. Like, the sanctions didn't work, and the army is holding on to the strategic initiative. And that's the narrative. The Kremlin is actively trying to push this narrative both domestically and abroad, as noted by the Financial Times. At the same time, analysts point out Russia's internal problems. Pressure on the economy due to military spending, growing deficit, inflation, difficulties with army recruitment, and discontent among servicemen. On the international stage, the Russian narrative is also no longer effective. Moscow is losing partners, and its attempts to exert influence in Europe are met with significant resistance. Alexander Valentinovich, how would you assess the actual results or effectiveness of the way the Russian Federation is behaving? Well, obviously, it doesn't work 100% of the time, maybe on some people, but overall, as of now, are there really people out there in Western countries who so unconditionally believe everything that comes out of the Kremlin towers?
Unfortunately, these types of individuals do exist. There are representatives of a variety of political parties in the West whom Russia has been actively trying to influence for many years. For example, in Germany, the Alternative for Germany party takes a pro-Russian stance. But on the other hand, we can say that in European societies, changes have taken place, and they are now actually seeing the Russian threat. We see that the situation has also changed in the United States, because if at the beginning of Donald Trump's presidency, only 35% of Republicans supported aid to Ukraine, now it's 2/3. And for example, those same 2/3 support providing Ukraine with tomahawks. So we see that sometimes society in certain countries is already ahead of some politicians, as is the case in the United States, for example. And politicians need to carefully consider and take this public opinion into account. And this is actually a very significant and crucial point to understand. For example, in Hungary, even though Orban consistently attempts to portray Ukraine as an enemy of Hungary, in reality, the majority of citizens, they support normal relations with the European Union and with Ukraine. And even the prominent opposition leader, Magyar, said that Orban's recent poll was a complete failure because even a significantly smaller number of people participated in it than there are members in Orban's own party. And all of this clearly shows that there's a real and significant opportunity to communicate Ukraine's position more effectively. And we see that it's getting harder and harder for Russia, really, in order to aggressively push its own narratives. And if we look at the sheer volume of financial resources Russia spends on its propaganda, we can see that the total amount continues to grow every single year. Not only because Russia is ramping up its efforts, but also because it's getting harder and harder for it to communicate and effectively deliver its messages to the Western world. And by the way, we can see that there are indeed problems with its allies as well. Over in the Eastern world, because both China and India are beginning to think more and more seriously about what exactly will happen if they choose to completely disregard the threat of international sanctions. For example, India serves as a compelling and clear illustration of how European and American sanctions, when they're imposed jointly, function together with a powerful synergistic effect. This is because India is now actively turning away shipments of Russian oil, not only because the United States is exerting significant diplomatic and economic pressure, but also because Europe, starting earlier this year, introduced strict new rules that completely prohibit selling that oil on the European market. Petroleum products that are made from Russian raw materials. And obviously, this scheme used to work before, but now India has to abandon it. And this is how we see that the pressure is truly effective. And if it is increased, then Russia will have no money left to wage this kind of high-intensity war. And the fact that they are constantly using the so-called National Wealth Fund, which is already close to being depleted, shows that Russia has few resources left to continue this war. And in fact, this answers the question of why Russia is trying to imitate an offense in other areas, because it needs to push for a ceasefire on its own terms. But so far, as we can see, it's not really working out.
You know, yes, it's very noticeable how in the Kremlin, whenever they give their comments in interviews with journalists, when they make these public statements, they always emphasize that the sanctions aren't working. But we understand that in this kingdom of crooked mirrors, as soon as we hear that something isn't working for them and that everything is going according to plan, we need to realize that, in fact, it's exactly the opposite. Maybe that's exactly why no one knows what was agreed upon in Anchorage, what Lavrov was talking about recently. And once again, Peskov stated that a breakthrough in negotiations to end the war in Ukraine is possible. But, as he said, only if the agreements reached in Anchorage are upheld. These are the words of Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary of the Russian dictator Putin. And by the way, he also added that the Kremlin supposedly doesn't want to discuss the details of these agreements publicly, and that he believes that talks about ending the war should take place behind closed doors. How dangerous is it that the Kremlin is keeping all this secret? After all, no one knows what was actually discussed in Anchorage and what hidden pitfalls there might be. Why the ongoing secrecy? And why has neither side spoken up? It makes sense for the Kremlin, but the states could have at least shared what was discussed in Switzerland.
And this creates more room for maneuver for Russia, because over there they talk about this mythical Anchorage formula. And all the time, notice, they keep adding some details that nobody had ever heard of before. Well, for example, if we are actually talking about that infamous 28-point plan that was supposedly based on the Anchorage formula, there were absolutely no questions about the church in it. And there were no questions about the language either. And actually, from this point of view, we can say that, unfortunately, taking advantage of the White House's silence, Russia is, so to speak, muddying the waters. And by the way, the White House should realize that this position drags things out and prevents effective progress in negotiations, especially when new information keeps popping up all the time. As for Donald Trump, it seems to me that at a certain point, he wasn't really paying much attention to these matters. But now, against the backdrop of public opinion and the upcoming election cycle, congressional elections and the Epstein scandal, I think they're afraid that if there were any concessions to Russia, making them public would be a pretty serious blow to the Republican standing. And that's why they choose this tactic of silence. Although, honestly, I think this ongoing silence, actually ends up damaging Donald Trump as well, because it ultimately looks like they were negotiating secret deals about things that voters might not forgive Donald Trump for.